The world's greatest cities have stories hidden in plain sight. How did a small Roman outpost become the center of the world's largest empire?
200 years ago, London was the center of everything.
How did this city invent time as we know it, the term happy hour, and afternoon tea?
This was the greatest thing that had ever been invented.
A medieval town burnt to the ground. How did it rise from the ashes and survive a blitz of German bombs?
Keep calm and carry on. It really is a belief system.
How did steam engines create London's most famous food, fish and chips? And how did a caffeine addiction create the world's first stock market? This is London, and you'll never look at it the same way again. "10:30 a.m. British Airways Flight 004 from New York is on final approach to London, following a course up the winding River Thames. 2,000 years earlier, Romans sailed along the same approach, and on a bend in the river built a small outpost they called Londinium. Today, that settlement has grown into a 600-square-mile metropolis of 8 million people. Captain Colin Creer has piloted this craft safely across the Atlantic Ocean. Now he and his crew face their greatest challenge. Landing at London City Airport, in the heart of the capital.
Well, landing at London City Airport is a challenging landing because there's a very steep approach which we have to make to avoid the built-up areas of Canary Wharf.
The runway ahead is only half the length of normal international runways. Passengers take in the view, unaware that here there is no margin for error. The notoriously short landing strip is a direct result of London's history. Turns out, this port wasn't originally built for planes. It was built for ships. If we go back in time 200 years, London was the busiest port in the world. It's 1815, the height of the British Empire. 1/4 of the land on Earth is under British rule, and the riches of the empire flow through this port.
200 years ago, London was the biggest international trading hub in the world. I mean, this was the center of a huge empire.
In the early 1800s, almost 1.5 million people live in London, the biggest city in the world. 100,000 Londoners earn their living from the docks. Every year, 60,000 ships, that's 165 per day, unload over 8 million tons of cargo.
Big ships were coming in with goods from all over the world, whether it's spices or goods or textiles, just arriving in this one spot that really now make it the city that it is today.
The docks are filled with exotic goods from colonies across the British Empire.
About 1/4 of the entire globe is within the empire, and all those boats are going back to London on a daily basis, right?
Just south of the wharf is a place that defies time, or more accurately, defines time. This is Greenwich, home of Greenwich Mean Time. That's 5 hours ahead of Eastern Standard. Long before smartphones and GPS, navigation depended on knowing the time and having a common reference for it. In 1884, Britain established Greenwich as ground zero for global time. Even today, it's still the center of time.
Since England was by far the world's dominant sea power, it made sense that they got to identify what your home base is in terms of when the clock starts. So even today, everything operates on Greenwich Mean Time. Everything else is seen in relation to it.
British sea power declined in the mid-20th century. The old docks were abandoned, and a new power rose to take its place. Tall ships were replaced by tall buildings. And by the 1980s, London had become a center of international finance. London now makes more money moving money than anything else. And all those international deals are fueled by one thing: coffee. And not in the way you'd think. We think of coffee shops as a perk of modern life. But what most people don't know is coffee shops were just as popular in London 300 years ago.
Coffee was like the crack of the 18th century. When people really started realizing how awesome coffee is, they would sit in these coffee shops and drink like 30 cups a day.
Coffee was imported to London from Turkey in the 17th century. The stimulating effects of caffeine caught on among London businessmen seeking an edge, and coffee shops quickly became the hub of the city's hyper-caffeinated financial crowd. One man, Johnny Castang, takes advantage of this gathering of money men and starts to issue a twice-weekly list of stock prices at Jonathan's Coffee House. Fortunes are made and lost selling shares at the coffee shop, which in 1773 is renamed the London Stock Exchange, now worth $3 trillion. Today, London has over 1,500 coffee shops, and more people drink coffee in London than in New York. Which is eye-opening, since coffee isn't even the caffeinated beverage Londoners are most famous for drinking. That, of course, is tea.
But I'll tell you where the best place to get a cup of tea is. It's not like the big department stores, or, it's not those places. There's these little green cabbie huts. And maybe 100 years ago, there were hundreds of them all over London. And this is where London cabbies can finally have a break. They park, and the little hut that's in the middle of the street only has room for like 6 seats, and you can't sit there. If you're not a cabbie, you can't sit in those seats, but you can walk up to the window and order a cup of tea. So that's how I like my tea in London.
It's just a place that cab drivers can go, get a cup of tea, or get something to eat, and there's always other cab drivers in there. And it's just a place to go and have a good moan, really. And it's just sort of like a rest place.
Simon is one of London's 20,000 cab drivers, and to earn that title is a lot harder than you'd think.
To an American, what's amazing about London cabs is the cab drivers know where they're going.
You never have to tell a London cabbie how to get anywhere.
London's thousands of years old, and it's not like a grid system or anything like that. You have to learn every direction of every single street and which way they face. You may think you're travelling in a straight line, but in actual fact, when you look on the map, you're doing a big sort of curvature shape.
If you've ever opened up a map book of London, your mind will go crazy. It looks like spaghetti. You have no idea how to get to anywhere.
London is so complicated, cabbies have to pass what's considered one of the hardest tests in the world, called the knowledge.
The knowledge is we have to learn near enough every single street, road, avenue, public building within 6 miles each way of Charing Cross, which is the centre of London. Something along the lines of 30,000 streets and about 60,000 places of interest that you've got to know.
GPS? What is that? They have it right up here.
And all that knowledge has an unexpected effect. A recent scientific study showed a part of London cab drivers' brains is larger than the rest of ours.
The knowledge does affect your brain. Inside your brain is the memory, which is called the hippocampus. And that part of your brain in all London cab drivers grows.
And that's not easy for any of us to forget. But neither is another consequence of London's medieval city map. Its narrow, winding streets became the catalyst for a catastrophe in the 1600s. Packed with wooden housing, London was like a tinderbox. One spark, and the whole city would go up in flames. London, September 2nd, 1666. The end of one of the hottest summers on record. This is a dirty, plague-ridden city of 500,000 people living in cramped old wooden housing. It's early morning. A fire starts in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The close proximity of the buildings means it spreads quickly, catching on dry thatched roofs and wooden houses. In a bid to contain the blaze, King Charles II issues a bold order: blow up all houses in the fire's path to block its advance. The barrier stops it from spreading, but the fire rages on for 5 days. Miraculously, only 6 people die, but most of the city lies in smoldering ruins. The king enlists Britain's greatest architect, Christopher Wren, to rebuild the city. Wren sees a blank canvas, tear it all down and redesign the city from the ground up. He proposes a grid system of boulevards and plazas like those planned for Paris. But London's wealthy landowners aren't about to redraw their property lines. So Wren begins rebuilding on the city's original medieval street plan. But instead of wood, they use brick and stone.
A lot of rebuilding went on, but the city wasn't as profoundly rethought as was Paris.
But one part of Wren's grand plan did achieve fruition: St. Paul's Cathedral, replacing the original wooden St. Paul's destroyed in the fire. Its new motto, engraved in Latin, is Resurgam, I will rise again. And rise it did. After 35 years of construction, St. Paul's enormous dome was second in size only to St. Peter's in Rome. Until the 1960s, it was the tallest building in London. And in 1981, it's the only cathedral large enough for the wedding of Charles and Diana.
Well, it's a wonderful shape, St. Paul's Cathedral, and there's nothing else like it.
St. Paul's is one of my favorite destinations in London. I love the view there. It's a great view.
1 mile north of St. Paul's is a second marvel of British architecture. Known as the Cathedral of the Railways, St. Pancras is among London's busiest train stations, a monument to the innovation that turned London into the modern metropolis of today. With the arrival of trains in the 1800s, raw materials could be transported quickly and efficiently from London to burgeoning industries outside of the city and throughout Britain. Instead of days, goods arrived in a matter of hours. Trains turned the entire country into an industrial machine, and London was its engine. Once the largest enclosed space in the world, today St. Pancras is an enduring testament to the ingenuity of its designers. Station manager Jay Newton knows every nook and cranny.
It's quite an incredible building. It really does give you an idea of what they undertook that 150 years ago.
From its roof, you get a real sense of the scale of the station.
Incredible, absolutely incredible building. The railways allowed the north of England to connect with London, and that's what made London what it is today. That's what brought the industry, the big industry and the Industrial Revolution from the north, the cotton, everything else that was happening in the north of London, down into London. It made it available.
With trains powering an industrial revolution, London grew exponentially, from 2 million to 4 million in less than 30 years. A 25 square mile city became a 100 square mile metropolis.
I think railways are enormously important to London. You just have to look at the stations. I mean, we have now St. Pancras, which has been put back to its original glory. It's wonderful.
St. Pancras has recently had a $1 billion renovation. The station itself has now become a destination. The old ticket office is now a bar. And the St. Pancras Hotel has been restored to Victorian perfection. Now you can wake up in St. Pancras, have breakfast, and get on a train for lunch in Paris.
From St Pancras, 2.5 hours, you're into Paris. 5 to 6 hours and you're into Avignon. And they're just starting services down to Marseille. So within 6 hours, you can be in Marseille, south of France, from the centre of London.
Today, trains arrive packed to the gills with passengers. But 200 years ago, they were often weighed down with another cargo, a commodity that would change London forever. 1,700 tons a week of North Sea cod. Once a highly perishable extravagance, trains made fish a meal everyone could afford, and London's signature food was born: fish and chips. Saul Rubin is co-owner of a fish and chip shop in West London.
Well, the railways enabled them to bring the fish down from the fishing ports in the north down to London, into the growing city in the south. So traditional fishing ports in Scotland and in Whitby and Hull, they could transport their fish a lot quicker down to the south of England in the capital, where there's obviously more people to feed and a higher demand. I love the simplicity of it. I love the fact that it's just 2 ingredients that can taste absolutely amazing and fill you up. And it's a very simple food, and I like simple dining. I like casual dining, and it's just a really nice way for a lot of people to have a big meal together without there being any pretense or any necessity for etiquette.
Fish and chips is served with mushy peas and drenched in salt and vinegar. This is classic London comfort food.
Oh, what do I love about fish and chips? 2 things that are fried.
Being an island, fish and chips was the only food throughout the entirety of the Second World War that was never rationed.
And that's how cod helped save the kingdom during World War II. But it was the British fighting spirit that beat the Nazi Blitz. And London was the image of that resolve. (1940) London. German bombs rain down on the British capital. To beat the British, Hitler wants to pummel them into submission. Instead of military targets, German bombers train their sights on civilians and the city of London. But the Fuhrer doesn't account for London's resolve.
Londoners have an incredible spirit, and that phrase, keep calm and carry on, that's really how they did it.
Keep calm and carry on is a mantra of the British in general. It's not just a clever phrase to be put on a coffee mug. It really is a belief system.
During the Blitz, as it became known, Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw St. Paul's Cathedral as a symbol of London's defiance, a structure that must be protected at all costs. But on December 29th, it comes under attack from the German Air Force. In the first 3 hours, they drop over 120 tons of explosives on London. Flames engulf the area around St. Paul's, and the cathedral dome takes a direct hit. Firemen and volunteers bravely battle the fire. 300 years earlier, the original St. Paul's was destroyed in the Great Fire of London. The new cathedral was now facing the same fate. From the roof of the Daily Mail building, photographer Herbert Mason watches the scene. Nobody can see the cathedral through the smoke, and many think it's gone. Then, just as Herbert snaps a picture, the smoke clears. The dome of St. Paul's is still there.
One of the great photographs of the Blitz is the picture of St. Paul's with smoke just billowing up from the rest of the city, but somehow this beautiful piece of history winds up standing. It's a kind of symbol of British will in the face of Nazi aggression.
Observing the heroism that went into preserving that structure was a big part of what allowed the U.S. to get over its isolationism and come to Britain's defense in the war.
30,000 Londoners died in the Blitz, and housing throughout the city was demolished. But the Nazis failed to topple one residence you can't miss. Buckingham Palace, residence at the time of King George VI. Today, 75 years later, Buckingham Palace is the home of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Out front of the palace is the famous balcony where the royal family appears on public occasions. But this balcony is a recent addition to the palace. Built in 1703 for the Duke of Buckingham, it was known as Buckingham House and was a modest dwelling. "60 years later, it was acquired by the royal family, and work began turning it into a palace. In 1837, Queen Victoria moved in. She decided it still wasn't big enough and made sure there were at least 240 bedrooms. To stop people peering into those rooms, the Queen pushed for a law that prevented any building in London from being over 80 feet tall.
One thing I love about London is that the zoning was actually done by order of the Queen, so no one could build a building tall enough to look into the palace. I think that's really tells you a lot about London and about English values.
It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the regulations were relaxed. In fact, it wasn't until 1962 that a building was built that was taller than St. Paul's. But now London's skyline is climbing into the sky. At 7 a.m., Chef Daniel Doherty heads up to work. He takes the elevator to the 40th floor. What a view. Daniel works in the Heron Tower, one of 22 stylish new skyscrapers built in the last 10 years. New Yorkers give their skyscrapers names like Empire State Building. Londoners probably do the same thing, right? Wrong.
We've got the cheese grater.
There's the gherkin.
The shards.
And then there's the walkie-talkie. We probably give our skyscrapers nicknames because we have a bit of a cheeky sense of humour.
At the top of the Heron Tower is the Duck and Waffle, where Daniel is head chef. Unlike New York, which never sleeps, London, in spite of its copious tea and coffee consumption, does. And not many of its 8,000 restaurants are open after midnight. The Duck and Waffle is one of the few exceptions.
You've got a restaurant that's full at 3 o'clock in the morning. If you come here on a Saturday at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's rammed. And that's, dining customers. That's not drinking, it's not a club, it's not a late night bar, it's a 24-hour restaurant.
All of the new skyscrapers give London a very 21st century look.
I have never gone to London and thought, oh, this is an old city. It's always pushing those boundaries, and it's doing so with architecture, as people usually do, but it's not doing as an affront to its history. It feels more natural and organic, but it's just this fascinating city that has both old and new, and they work side by side.
This is the Shard, the tallest building in Western Europe, and one of the newest, and it stands right next to one of the oldest landmarks, Borough Market.
Borough Market is brilliant. I mean, I found out the other day it's been here 1,000 years. It's amazing.
Borough Market has been in continuous operation since 1014. It's the oldest market in London and a food lover's destination.
You can pick up a brace of pheasants and walk home like Henry VIII, or you can, you know, grab a fresh juice. Or no, it is brilliant, genuinely. I'd get very, very fat if I lived here, though, because I just eat all day.
Borough offers pretty much any type of food you can imagine.
Borough Market is famous from all sorts of different foods from all over the world.
From French cheeses, olives and bread, to English pies, Spanish paella, and Asian curries. It perfectly reflects the multicultural feel of the city.
What city in the world has grown more and become more international and changed more in the last 10, 15 years than London? There seems to be a fantastic balance now with both Anglican London and immigrant London, the ethnic experience there.
Borough Market is a perfect place to pick up a prime cut of beef, the basis of one of London's traditions, the Sunday roast. Originally given to farm workers hundreds of years ago on Sundays after church.
Horseradish?
It's such a part of British culture, the French refer to the Brits as roast beef.
If you're coming to London, you really need to have a roast dinner, because that's what we're known for best in England.
If you're coming to London, yeah, you'll definitely have to have a roast beef dinner. Try it out, see how you like it.
I really think like roast beef and the idea of the roast dinner is part of our like national identity as well. It comes hand in hand with tea and crumpets, I think.
Throughout Britain, roast beef satisfies the heartiest of appetites. But in London, it's beer that keeps the city's spirits afloat. And there's one place where it flows like the River Thames, the pub. It doesn't matter where you are in London. Look around. You're always near a pub. There are over 7,000 in London town.
I think that Americans are always stunned how, you know, every block doesn't just have one, it usually has two. I do think it goes back to a time where so many people were living in places where entertaining just wasn't an option. You needed a public place to see and be seen, and you needed a place to leave the work behind.
It's really a community center. I mean, for us, it's a bar, but it's not a bar. The whole community can come out and read the paper and talk to one another. You can bring your dog, you can bring your kids. I think it's just, the pub is the lifeblood of London, the London pub.
The pub, short for public house, is a British invention. So too is happy hour, a term coined by William Shakespeare. But among this community of drinkers, what's on tap next isn't always beer. Many reach for a spirit with a long, dubious history: gin. For centuries, Londoners distilled their own gin illegally. It was like moonshine with an equally bad reputation. And most places that sold it were seedy, rowdy dives. But in the 1800s, commercial distillation took off and a cleaner, smoother gin emerged. Dubbed London Dry Gin, this new refined drink appealed to a more sophisticated drinker, and lavish gin palaces, like the Viaduct Tavern, were built to cater to them. Today, gin is still a popular drink with Londoners, and the Viaduct's specialty cocktail is, you guessed it, a traditional gin and tonic.
Gin is an amazing drink.
I've always associated gin and tonic with being a very British and even a very London drink.
I think London is the home of gin. It's part of our history.
Gin and tonic might be distinctly British, but it was born in India. In the 1800s, British soldiers in India drank a quinine tonic to prevent malaria. But the taste of quinine is bitter, so they mixed the tonic with gin. And so the classic G&T was born. A small sample of how India changed the taste of London. For 300 years, India was part of the British Empire. The empire had many colonies around the world, like Australia, Malaysia, and Canada, all governed from London. But India was the jewel in the crown. And that left its mark on London, not just with gin and tonic, but also curry. London is now the world capital of Indian food. There are 2,000 Indian restaurants in London, more than in Mumbai and Delhi combined.
Potato paratha coming, yes? Some of my favorite Indian restaurants in the world were always in London. But now, I mean, you're seeing, you know, starred restaurants that are serving Indian food in London.
I love a London curry. It's one of the things I miss most about not living in London. There is Indian food in New York, but it's not the same.
At the Cinnamon Club, chef and owner Vivek Singh is getting ready for the night ahead.
29, one garlic naan coming, please.
During the Empire, thousands of British officials and military personnel would often spend years in India.
So, you know, for all these people who had worked and lived a good part of their working life in India, when they brought back spices and all those influences that they had become accustomed to, it was only natural that Indian food automatically had a foothold in the drawer. I describe it as the romance of the Raj, really.
The first Indian restaurant opened in London 200 years ago.
On bread selection, black lentil on the side.
Indian food is now so popular that in a recent poll of British national dishes, chicken tikka masala came out on top, beating fish and chips.
Chicken tikka masala, is it the national dish of Britain? I do think curry has taken over and taken over Britain, but also made London its home like you cannot imagine a few years ago.
Today, the population of London is made up of 270 nationalities, speaking over 300 languages. It seems like the whole world connects in London.
We've always in England been a country where people have come, whether it be from Germany or from the West Indies or from Scotland, you know, the Vikings, the Celts. We're a great mixture. I think we're very lucky.
With diversity in its DNA, London always has and always will look different. But one London look remains unchanged, a timeless fashion icon that's never out of style. The Savile Row hand-tailored suit. At the height of the empire, the British government built the Houses of Parliament. From here, it ruled over a quarter of the world's population.
I think you see that sense of empire in the buildings. They're often just what's carved, you know. That British sense of rightness and of language, you know, that English is the language.
Parliament is the site of the most famous clock in the world, known as Big Ben. But Big Ben is really the name of the big bell that tolls on the hour, and its distinct sound is actually a mistake. 2 months after it was hung in St. Stephen's Tower, one of the hammers cracked the bell. It was repaired, but the crack remains, giving the bell its distinctive sound. The bell was cast by the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, which also made the Liberty Bell, which also cracked. Another long-standing legacy of the British Empire is the suit. If cities have a man's uniform, it's this, and it was born in London.
You know, if you just look around you and you see some guy, you know, wearing a suit, many people would be very surprised to know that that's actually a modified military uniform. That style with the notched collar and the button comes out of the uniform manufacturing during the Napoleonic War in London.
200 years ago, Savile Row made all Britain's military officer uniforms. But then, a 19th century visionary asked for a radical alteration. Strip it of military ornament and fashion it for everyday use. His name was Beau Brummel, fashion consultant to royalty, confidant to Prince George.
As is often the case, when the Prince Regent, later to become George IV, starts wearing this newfangled garment that no one was particularly keen on, as soon as they saw this member of the royal family wearing it, they figured, I gotta go get me one of them suits.
At Cad and the Dandy, the old tradition of hand tailoring continues.
We set up in 2008, so we're the newest guys on the block on Savile Row. A lot of these companies have been going for 100 years, 200 years in some cases.
From measuring, it takes 10 weeks to make a tailored suit. Each stage of a Savile Row suit is done by hand, taking at least 60 man-hours. And most Savile Row tailors only make around 350 suits a year.
Tailoring for 50 years, nearly 50 years. Well, my grandfather was a tailor, and my father, and I'm just following in the footsteps.
The suit in its current form hasn't changed, an enormous amount in the last 150 years. The construction methods certainly haven't. It's done the old-fashioned way because it's simply the best way.
The Savile Row suit is tailored for a man who's always thinking ahead. And at 3 p.m., he's probably thinking about this, a uniquely British indulgence, afternoon tea. Behind the cloak of tradition hides one of London's most decadent dining experiences. Cakes, scones, finger sandwiches piled high on a silver platter tower. This is afternoon tea.
I went to London the year that I turned 12, and we're staying at some fancy pants hotel. I was with my dad, and you took tea. And I thought it was the greatest thing in the whole world, because as a 12-year-old, especially as an American 12-year-old, it wasn't about the gentility of it. It was a 3-tiered silver treat carrier loaded with little sweets and goodies, and then I got to have something with caffeine in it. This was the greatest thing that had ever been invented.
Like all great inventions, afternoon tea wasn't perfected overnight. In fact, it was centuries in the making. The first tea came from China to London in the 17th century. But the British government taxed it so heavily that only the rich could afford it. At one point, the tea tax was 119%. The British government also taxed tea sold in the colonies. You know the story. There was a famous tea party in Boston Harbor, all because of the tea tax. 10 years after the American Revolution, the British government dropped the tax on tea, and it quickly became the most popular drink in Britain. Then, in the 1840s, a friend of Queen Victoria took tea to new heights.
So it was actually originated from one of Queen Victoria's ladies-in-waiting. Her name was the Duchess of Bedford, and she described a sinking feeling that she would get in her stomach around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So she would order some tea, and she'd get her servants to sneak up some sandwiches and cakes to her room, and it really took off as a social occasion.
Any woman who says, I would like to eat more, and therefore create an entire meal that everyone now has to partake in, is all right with me.
For over 150 years, Brown's Hotel has served afternoon tea, following the royal tradition of overindulgence. Every afternoon, they make 500 pots of tea and over 1,000 sandwiches. A team of chefs bake over 500 scones, as another puts the finishing touches on a cake.
You know, the idea of sitting and taking that kind of break is a social function that we don't have in America and never really did. And I think that's a shame. The break for tea and the ability to actually converse with other human beings and take that pause during the day, I think has a lot of social value.
But like all good things, afternoon tea must pass, and Londoners return to the business of building for the future. The population is expected to reach 10 million by 2025. So the city is adding to the world's oldest subway, the Tube. Price, $20 billion. Name, Crossrail. All across the city, huge new stations are rising out of the ground. This is the new station at Paddington.
Well, down here, this is the construction of the station itself. And what you can see down there is pretty much the platform level, so that's where the trains will be coming in.
10,000 people are working on 40 construction sites across London.
Oh yeah, I do feel proud being on the Crossrail project, yeah. My father was here for 40 years working on the main station. So he spent 30 years on Paddington Station, and then 10 years prior to that, he was a black cabbie ranking on Paddington Station. So then I come along with Crossrail and help build this part of the job.
This machine is named Victoria, after Queen Victoria. It took 8 of these to drill out a 14-mile tunnel under the city.
The tunnels were created using tunnel boring machines, 4 meters in diameter, big teeth on the front, and they just gnaw their way through the clay of London.
During drilling, they found ancient burial sites of bubonic plague victims and remains of a Roman road. It's the past and the future of London all together in the underground.
What I love about London is this layering of beautiful ancient architecture and an urban layout, along with a lot of new technology that somehow fits alongside things that are 400 or 500 years old.
London is no longer the center of an empire, but it's still the world's #1 city destination. There's an old saying that if you're tired of London, you must be tired of life, because London has all that life has to offer.